Alright. We're going to take about half of our time to talk about the court, and then Roosevelt's court packing plan, and then we'll talk about it. Not enough case at all. He was smart. Alright, so the topic of today's kind of formal lecture is Roosevelt's court packing scheme. But so we're going to actually spend kind of most of our time in a civics lesson talking about the Supreme Court, and then once you kind of understand the Supreme Court, Roosevelt's court packing scheme takes 3 minutes to explain, and it's easy as pie to understand. So to make it easy as pie to understand, and it's something that's very often on the AP test, it has been in the past, let's talk about the Supreme Court. First of all, how many justices on the Supreme Court? 9. 9 justices. The number 9 is not in the Constitution.
It's 7, right?
The,
it's supposed to be 7?
No. The number is nowhere indicated in the Constitution. The number of Supreme Court justices is thereby established by whom? The President doesn't make laws in the United States. Supposedly. Congress. The number is set by congressional statute. Statute is a law. The first Congress, back in 1789, got together and said, we're going to have 6. And then they changed it to 7. And then they changed it to 9. And then they changed it to 10. And then they brought it back to 7. And after the Civil War, Congress said 9. And it's been 9 since right after the Civil War. But tomorrow, if Congress wanted to change it to 11, they could. That is simply set by statute. It is not set by the Constitution or anything like that, but there are 9. Okay? Next question. How long does a Supreme Court justice serve on the court floor? For life. For life. Serves for life. A justice serves for life. He or she may resign, but if they do not choose to resign, they serve until they are wheeled out horizontally. They serve for life. The reason for that is so that the founders set it up this way, so that the Supreme Court justices are not worrying about being reelected. They simply have to apply the law as they see fit. How does a Supreme Court justice become a Supreme Court justice?
You get appointed, right?
Appointed by the president, and then what? First step.
And then,
Accepted by Congress?
Accepted by the Senate, confirmed by the Senate. Folks, we really need a better, we talk about all these things, you need a better understanding of how the system is supposed to work.
Supposed to work.
Like when you sit here and yell at me that the president makes laws and you need to do better than that. If you're going to ever waste your time voting. 9 justices, the number is set by congressional statute. They serve for life. They are appointed by the president. They are confirmed by the Senate. What do they do? You don't go in front of the Supreme Court if you have a traffic ticket. The Supreme Court does not deal with murder cases. What does the Supreme Court do?
Something that goes against the Constitution?
No, they don't. I mean, maybe, but like they didn't handle the OJ case. You know, the OJ case was handled by a district court in Los Angeles.
constitutional?
So, what the Supreme Court does is it has three major roles. One is it's, go back, Marbury v. Madison, what's the first kind of major role? It has the power of what?
Oh, to say something unconstitutional.
Yeah, so to determine constitutionality of laws. Determine the constitutionality of laws. Judicial review, Martin v. Madison. The second thing that it does is kind of intimately related to the first. So the first one is Congress passes a law, somebody says this law is not constitutional, that can go all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the court will determine whether that law is or is not in fact constitutional. The second thing that the court does is it makes certain that the government is enforcing the laws constitutionally. Was that search a violation of my Fourth Amendment rights? I don't know. That is the sort of things that can get up to the Supreme Court. You know, if you post something on Twitter, can the school principal get you in trouble for that? So this, like, Mr. Cummings might claim he can, but that issue has not been determined as a matter of law. If you're sitting in your bedroom, you might be in violation of a bullying statute, but is that bullying statute constitutional?
No.
I don't know, is my point.
Only they can decide, right?
If it ever gets to the Supreme Court, they will decide what limits, what limitations on your speech are constitutional or not. Eventually, they might be the ones that decide whether, the school district can get you in trouble in school for stuff that you did on a private account in the privacy of your home outside of school hours. Those are things that eventually are going to be determined. Where does the Fourth, because obviously the founders never counted on Twitter, but the Fourth Amendment is still the Fourth Amendment. It's a damn good thing. And it's up to the justices to kind of determine where the Fourth Amendment falls on that sort of thing. The third thing, yeah.
Has that ever gotten up to there?
Not yet. It will. It will.
Okay.
It will. It will. Some kid gets suspended for tweeting, something at 9 o'clock at night. It'll eventually get. Because principals are applying the bullying law strictly, and I don't know. Look, I've said this before. You don't have a right not to be offended. You might have an expectation that people shouldn't offend me, but there's First Amendment out there. Unless someone is, actively about to injure you, then constitutional speech protections are very, very strong. So, that's what the Supreme Court does. All right, so, moving along rapidly. The Constitution is not a lengthy document. It's 4 pages long. That's it. You could copy it down in one sitting if you were so inclined. And because it is short, it is open to a great deal of interpretation. And we saw this from the beginning. We saw Jefferson interpreting the Constitution along his philosophical and judicial philosophy. Jefferson said, farmers are best, limited government is the best, and therefore, he had this, idea in his head about what the world was like, and he interpreted the Constitution according to that way that he saw the world. Hamilton had a different conception of the world. Hamilton thought that a country needed to be strong. The country got strong through trade and finance. A central government was the most important, and then obviously he interpreted the Constitution differently based on his political and his judicial philosophy of the world. So I think we can all agree that thing about that we can look at things, and based on where our minds are and what we consider to be important, whether you think negative liberty or positive liberty is more important, whether you think public safety or individual rights is more important, that we, based on who we are, I don't think any of us would argue that there's only one way to interpret this. That I'm sure if we sat here and thought about it, that instance about, can we suspend a kid for something on Twitter, we could think of good arguments on both sides. I don't think that any of us are so ideologically blinkered that we would say there is only one possible way to answer that question. That I think we are aware, and if we were tasked, if you were individually tasked with making that decision, you would really have to give it a lot of thought and really kind of logically parse every possible way to look at that. And you would come up with something that reflected your personal, judicial, philosophical, political beliefs. Agreed? I think so. All right, so, the hell's that got to do with this? Well, it's got to do with this in the sense that what type of people do the presidents choose to nominate to be on the Supreme Court?
People that follow their party.
Well, not necessarily their party, but their beliefs, their ideas, their ideals, their philosophies, maybe even their party. That we would expect John Adams to appoint Federalists to the Supreme Court. We would expect Franklin Roosevelt to appoint liberal Democrats. We would expect Ronald Reagan to appoint conservatives. That is kind of odd. Why would we expect, the liberal President Obama to appoint someone to the court who completely disagrees with his political and judicial philosophy? He would be stupid. So the question I'm going to start this with is, I'm going to make a statement, and I want you to try to explain it to me. The Supreme Court is an anti-democratic institution. That's the statement. The Supreme Court is an not an and it's also an undemocratic institution. We don't vote for the guys who sit on it. We don't ever get to re-vote for the guys who sit. So it's undemocratic, yes. But it's also anti-democratic. What does that mean? That the Supreme Court is an anti-democratic institution?
They go against people having a voice on the subject.
What do you mean?
So if there's like a case and then they don't want people to say, oh, well, we the people of New Jersey believe that. The side of the
What's the end of that thought? What do you mean? I'm not...
like anti-democratic would be like that the Supreme Court doesn't want like the people of New Jersey having a say in the case. They want to have all.
What if they say, well, that's not necessarily true. What if the Supreme Court says this is not an issue for the Supreme Court, it's up to the legislature of the state of New Jersey? Right? What if, all these same-sex marriage cases that are coming before the Supreme Court this term, what if the court says this is not something for the court to determine, this is up to every individual state? Then, the Supreme Court, in that particular ruling, is being very democratic. But the Supreme Court itself as an institution is anti-democratic.
I have a question on that. Okay, so the Supreme Court, they don't have a jury, right? They
Correct.
decide on their own. So wouldn't that be undemocratic because it limits the power of the people, because it's only the people that are in the Supreme Court that decide whether or not it's constitutional or not. Like, people don't have, outside people that aren't in the Supreme Court don't have a say in whether it is like a regular court case or something where there is a jury. So,
Well, the Supreme Court is the jury. They decide. It's not a matter, it's like, you're confusing criminal, the Supreme Court does not determine guilty or not guilty. It's not a criminal court. You don't sit, there's not witnesses, there's not the stand, there's not open, there's those things, but it's not a criminal court, it's an appellate court. It's a court of appeals. Alright, so it doesn't work that way. the Supreme Court basically says, here's one side, here's the other, just sit here and talk to us, make your case. And unlike a regular judge, what the Supreme Court does when it hears a case is, here's all the lawyers for this side, here's all the lawyers for that side, and the Supreme Court will say, all right, get up, make your case, and then the 9 of us will pepper you, the lawyer, with questions. And then, all right, your turn to make your case, and then we'll pepper you with questions. And then the 9 of us will go back and make a ruling on the constitutionality of the thing. Okay?
It's anti-democratic because usually in a democracy we elect the people that get to be in, like, I guess, our government, and then in the Supreme Court they're appointed.
Yeah, that makes it undemocratic, but not anti-democratic.
That's that they go against.
They go against democracy, directly against democracy.
They just want to get power.
Well, it's the power enshrined to them in the Constitution. All right, let's see if we can walk our way down closer to the answer.
Okay then.
We're going to go, because go ahead.
Okay, we were thinking that, isn't democracy like accepting other people's opinions? Like part of it? Okay, so we were thinking, is it anti-democratic because when you appoint them, the president appoints them and the Senate confirms them because they agree with their, political and judicial views? And that's not really democratic because they're not looking at other people's opinions or other views.
So are you going to argue that in the United States now, same-sex marriage enjoys about a 60% approval rating? If the justices determine there's a constitutional right to same-sex marriage, that's undemocratic? The majority of American people want it.
I don't think I was touching on that. I was talking about how they appoint them. They appoint them on like, if they agree with their views.
Right.
They don't appoint them like,
So like what's being made, it would be from, like, let's say if the
So if the
liberals-
American, so let's go with Leslie's point. The American people voted for President Obama. The American people voted for a Democratic Senate. Obama nominates a Democrat, a liberal, to be on the Supreme Court. Isn't that exactly in line with the views of the American people? All right, let's work our way through this.
Okay.
Let's go through the 9 people on the court very quickly.
Wait, their name?
Yeah. Antonin Scalia. Antonin Scalia has been on the court for the longest of anybody at the current time. Antonin Scalia was appointed to the court in 1986 by President Ronald Reagan. Antonin, Italian guy. Yeah,
What's the longest anyone has ever been there?
John Marshall,
How long?
35 years.
How old is she?
Anthony Kennedy, appointed to the Supreme Court by Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan left office in January of 1989. Ronald Reagan has been out of office for 26 years. Scalia is about, I think Scalia is 81 or 82. Ronald Reagan's been dead 11 years now. But two of the guys that Ronald Reagan appointed to the Supreme Court are still on the Supreme Court. Justice Clarence Thomas was appointed to the court by George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush left office in January of 1993. He has been out of office for over 20 years. Justice Ginsburg and Justice Breyer were appointed by President Clinton.
They can't be kicked off.
Nope. They can be impeached if they commit a crime, but otherwise they serve for life. Justice Roberts, the Chief Justice, and Sam Alito were appointed to the court by George W. Bush.
agree with them, get stuck.
And Sonia Sotomayor and Eleanor Kagan were appointed to the court by Obama. Now,
Oh wait, is that a lady? So
yeah,
The first.
Obama.
You can add like
That is
of
Hispanic?
any.
I'm sorry? Is she what? I will ask the question again. What makes the Supreme Court an anti-democratic institution? Jason?
That they can't be kicked off.
So?
I don't,
It's not even.
I don't know how to like.
It's not even. No.
Oh, I know. Because the president's the one that appointed them, and then in a democracy, the leader of the country is not the one with power.
What?
What does that mean?
Okay.
I don't understand what that means.
She didn't
You
speak
guys can
English.
stop talking in this.
What? What do you mean?
I get it.
I don't get it.
I think she's trying to say.
Go ahead, Diana.
I think she's trying to say that because the president appointed them, they have like the power or whatever, and like the president is supposed to be the person with like all the power or whatever.
Really?
But yeah, that and then
The Senate doesn't have any power?
no, but like not all the power, but like the most power.
Okay.
And then, but then, and then I think she's referring to the last question, the one that we're trying to pick. I mean, discuss that the reason why it's like anti-democratic or whatever.
Like maybe the people
Is
should select the people to be in the Supreme Court now.
Well, the founders said that the founder didn't want them to.
And then, as I was saying, was because like since the president has the most power, it's like kind of like Congress is picking laws and stuff, but
Congress doesn't pick laws.
I mean,
Rights.
writes the laws, or
Mr.
whatever,
Smith
and picks what's right.
Okay, in the Constitution it says that we the people, so shouldn't the people pick who's up there? Or
They
is
are.
the
They elect a president, they elect a Senate
What
that
is the-
confirms, that appoints and confirms these guys. How is that different from the electoral college?
This is my.
They've all been picked by different presidents, and the presidents weren't all in the same parties.
Yes.
What?
What?
All in the same party.
Keep going.
Alright, so
Finish your thought, Michael.
Alright, okay.
Nice
so
job.
Obama and Washington. Obama was a Democrat and Washington was, not Washington,
George
George
W.
W. Bush was, sorry, I saw the W.
Come on.
He was a Republican.
Right.
So they're from two different parties, so
Right.
they obviously have two different views.
Right?
So in
So what makes it anti-democratic? Finish your thought. Come on, Michael. Michael's 90% of the way down the road.
Come on, Michael, bring us home. Bring us home.
Rounding
Take
third.
us to home
Down the
gate.
stretch he comes.
they're gonna argue that they have different views on what's constitutional. One can
Yeah.
have
But then how's that anti-democratic?
because
Michael, let me ask you a question. All right, here we're gonna drag Michael across the finish line here, folks. Ronald Reagan is a
I'm gonna hit a
conservative,
home run.
last elected in 1984. The last time Ronald Reagan won an election was 31 years ago. His two guys are still on the court. The last time.
Alexis Lanza, please report to the main office. Alexis Lanza.
George H.W. Bush, generally a conservative. Last time he won an election was 1988.
So they have.
Bill Clinton, last won an election in 1996. He's liberal. The last two times the country had a presidential election, the country voted for a liberal. The country said, we went to the polls, we voted, we picked Obama, he's a liberal, we want liberals. What kind of court do you got?
Conservative.
You have a court with a whole bunch of conservatives that we are still as a country going with the picks of presidents that were elected by the American people 30 years ago that the Supreme, now if we look, since 1984, it's been pretty even. You had Reagan twice and Bush, and then Clinton twice, W twice, and then Obama twice. So it's been kind of back and forth. So if we look, there's 4 conservatives on the court. There's 4 liberals on the court.
Aren't there 5 conservatives?
And there's Justice Kennedy, the big squishy moderate here in the middle.
Apparently what's that person called? Head?
The Chief Justice?
Yeah, there we go.
Chief Justice is
But he's the conservative
John Roberts.
too.
He's kind of over here. That's Roberts.
How is he made?
When the Chief Justice dies.
But wait,
But how do you become Chief Justice? Why can't any of the other ones be?
Because you're not appointed, you're appointed Chief Justice.
Oh.
Yeah,
so
there's
it's like-
eight associate justices and a Chief Justiceship.
but Mr.
The Chief
Why?
Justice says the final say?
No, the Chief Justice just has more paperwork to do.
Oh.
It's not, they each have one equal vote.
So no one
No.
wants, so no one cares to be Chief Justice?
But wait.
You get to administer the oath of office to the president, there's perks.
Cool.
Mr. But how come it's kind of uneven because there's 5 against 4?
Yeah. Because the American people since 1980 have elected a conservative 80, 84, 88, 2000, 2004, 5 times, and they've elected a liberal 4 times. That's elections. Why is that bad? Doesn't that, Paula, doesn't that reflect the will of the American people over the last 30 years? Yes, no? Does that reflect the will of the American people over the last 30 years?
I just think it should be equal
Why?
because that way you always have an equal balance on what to decide.
Why should you have an equal balance? Let me ask you a question. But let's draw Paula's reasoning out logically. All right? Paula thinks there should always be a balance on the Supreme Court. I think that's ass backwards. If we take Paula's belief to its logical conclusion, let's say that liberal Democrats win the next 10 elections. The entire American people move politically to the left. We vote for liberal presidents, we vote for liberal senates, we vote for liberal House members. The American people clearly want liberals. Why should the Supreme Court be half conservative?
But they're for life, so they can't be.
But they're gonna die.
Paula?
It's just everyone else coming in.
No, give me your, why? Give me your, make it
Because
more
like,
argument.
I always feel like you always have to have like that backing, like, you know, someone that's against so that like they can always like, I guess, continue.
So with that, should we, so let's take Paula's argument that we should always have some, so Paula, should we, according to, you take that logical belief to its obvious conclusion, shouldn't we always, once every 4 elections, guarantee that a conservative wins the presidency? Why not?
Because that's not what the people want.
The people don't want half the conservatives on the Supreme Court.
But
In my scenario where, you know, liberals won the next 10 elections, the American people clearly don't want conservatives.
well, sometimes the things that you want are not always the right thing.
Ah, well, you're absolutely right. That's why we have elections.
And like the founders say, sometimes when you give people the option to choose, they choose wrong.
Right, which is why we have elections every 4 years for president and for the House every 2 years. The makeup of the court, guys, the makeup of the court shows that in the last 30 years, the American people have done what? They have not decided what they want. Over the last 30 years, we have swung back and forth from liberal to conservative, and obviously, as a result of that, we have a Supreme Court that looks, quite frankly, in its ideological opinions, exactly like the rest of the country. Divided right down the middle. Why is the Supreme Court divided down the middle? The country is divided down the middle. if the country in the last 30 years had been, hey-o conservatives, there'd be all conservatives on the Supreme Court. And if for the last 30 years the country had said, hey-o liberals, there'd be all liberals on a Supreme Court. And that is a perfect segue. Now that we understand sort of how this works, and we're running out of time to do Hitler. Oh. Let's do the history. Why is it anti-democratic? It's anti-democratic because the last 2 times the American people have picked a liberal. But the last time the United States elected a conservative president was 11 years ago. Now, we might again in 2016, and then, President Walker or President, Bush again, or President whatever. She's liberal. Could
She said bacon.
bring it back the other way. Anyway. When Roosevelt comes to office in 1932, Roosevelt comes into office in 1932. He is a liberal Democrat. He is elected with a liberal Democratic Congress, overwhelmingly veto-proof majorities. Great time to be president, because he has a Congress that 75% of the members agree with him. What does that have to do with the president of Congress? The president, with his allies in Congress, start passing all of these New Deal laws that we have seen. Fundamentally, as we have seen, changing the relationship between citizen and government. Laws about, prices, wages, who has the power, control, regulation, all these things that are breaking new ground in stuff that the federal government does. But Roosevelt is being stymied by the Supreme Court. Because if we look back, people, first of all, didn't live quite as long then. If we look back, on the Supreme Court when Franklin Roosevelt took office, were 8 conservatives and 1 lonely progressive. The ancient old Oliver Wendell Holmes, who you know from Buck v. Bell. He's 80 some odd years old. He was appointed all the way back, I think, by Taft. And he's still hanging. Taft is actually on the Supreme Court. He's the Chief Justice. There was nothing in the world Taft wanted more than to be, he never wanted to be president. He always wanted to be Chief Justice. So after he was president, I think it was Harding appointed him to the Supreme Court.
But why didn't he go on the progressive side?
Who?
Taft appointed him.
Yes.
And Taft appointed a
Taft
progressive.
appointed, yes.
But then when Taft got appointed, he wasn't.
Well, Taft was always kind of philosophically more conservative. He might have been appointed by Roosevelt, even, like Ted. I'm not certain who appointed all the way.
Were a lot of them assassinated?
No.
There's only 3 people who got 3 presidents who got 4.
Anyway, this is and the reason why we have 8 conservatives, the reason but we'll do a little bit. The reason we have 8 conservatives and only 1 liberal is because the last 3 presidents, the last 3 elections, the election of 1920, 24, 28, had all elected conservatives. And those 3 conservatives, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, had appointed conservatives to the Supreme Court. So, when Roosevelt's stuff starts getting passed through Congress, lots of it gets shot down by this conservative Supreme Court. Roosevelt tries to finagle his way around this problem. And Roosevelt attempts what historians have come to know as the court hacking scheme. Now, it's a funny word.
As a negative.
Scheme has a definite negative connotation. No good guy in a movie ever has a scheme. What does the good guy have? The good guy has a plan. The bad guy has a scheme. Roosevelt's scheme is very simple, now that we kind of understand how the court works, guys. What Roosevelt wants to do, he wants Congress to change the law. He wants Congress to change the law about how we pick, how many Supreme Court justices there are. Now what Roosevelt says is for every justice over the age of 70, for every justice over 70, I appoint an extra judge, not a replacement, an extra justice up to 15. So, since 6 of them are over the age of 70, Roosevelt, if this passes, will pick 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 new judges. And then as these old guys start dying, all of a sudden Roosevelt's got an easy schmeezy, quicky quacky majority on his court. Problems. This is Roosevelt's court packing scheme. Now that we kind of understand how the court works, it's very simple. Reaches too far. Not only conservatives, but people in his own party go against this very, very quickly. And they make the argument that, is this technically legal? Can Congress do this? Yeah. But in the age of rising dictators around the world, this is the sort of funny business that dictators do. That you play with the constitutional setup for your own partisan gain. And a lot of people, even Roosevelt's allies in Congress, in the press, said, this is a bridge too far. This is the stuff that dictators do. This is not the, you have to have respect for the process. You want to replace the justices, you got to wait for them to die. That's how we do things in this country. We don't sit there and finagle with the rules to make it easier for you to do what you want to do politically. That's the court packing scheme. It does not come into effect. Roosevelt suffers politically for it, and it's after this court packing scheme that Roosevelt kind of turns his focus onto foreign affairs because he wants to make people forget about this, because it really hurt his popularity. In the end, Roosevelt wins anyway, because Roosevelt wins 4 elections. He gets elected 4 times. These old guys die, and Roosevelt picks his own guys anyway.
He gets a full Supreme Court.
Pretty much. Roosevelt appointed 10 people to the Supreme
So
Court.
World War I, there wasn't an election?
There was not an election during World War I. There was an election in 1916 and an election in 1920. Yeah, 1944. Roosevelt gets elected 32, 36, 48, and 44.
Why?
Because he ran and won.
Wait, how come there's no elections during wartime?
There is.
Oh, I thought you just said that.
There was congressional elections every 4 years. If they don't happen to fall when the fighting's going on, there's, right? Like, we have elections every 4 years. There's an election before Pearl Harbor in 1940, and there's an election once the war is 3/4 over in 1944. When the way our system works, we can't make a new election, like in Great Britain. Great Britain, the Prime Minister can call an election whenever he wants.
Really?
Yeah, that's part of the system. In the United States, it's every 4 years, period. So I'm going to use this idea that Roosevelt was sort of acting in a dictatorial way to segue into everyone's favorite dictator, Hitler. So.